The stench hit Private Daniel Kowalski before his eyes adjusted to the darkness inside the freight car. It was April 19th, 1945, and the liberation of Oświęcim, what the Germans called Auschwitz, was 3 months behind them. But the railroad sidings still held secrets. Rotting corpses stacked like cordwood, documents burned in haste, and sometimes, impossibly, survivors. Daniel had been searching these abandoned train cars for 2 weeks, part of a cleanup detail nobody wanted. At 28, he'd seen enough death in France and Germany to last 3 lifetimes. But Poland was different. Poland was personal. His grandparents had left Krakow for Pittsburgh in 1903. Every village they passed through could have been home. The freight car sat on a siding outside Brzezinka, doors sealed from the outside with a Wehrmacht padlock. When Daniel's bolt cutters finally snapped the lock, the door slid open with a shriek of rusted metal. Bodies, dozens of them. Women and children mostly, dressed in striped prisoner uniforms, their faces frozen in final agony. Daniel had learned to breathe through his mouth during these searches, to catalog what he saw without really seeing it. He was 3 bodies deep when he heard it. A whimper, animal soft and terrified. His flashlight beam swept across the pile and caught movement, a small hand withdrawing beneath a woman's body. Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs as he climbed into the car, his boots slipping on God knows what. He lifted the woman's body carefully, respectfully, and found her. A little girl, maybe 4 years old, maybe 5. Blonde hair matted with filth, eyes enormous in her skeletal face, and clutched in her small fist, barely visible beneath her tattered coat, was a silver medallion on a chain. Daniel reached for her slowly, the way you'd approach a wounded animal. The child didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at him with those haunted blue eyes. "It's okay," he said in Polish. "You're safe now." No response. He tried again in his broken German. "Ich helfe dir." I help you. The child's eyes flickered with recognition. She spoke, her voice barely a whisper, but the words were clear enough. "Vati ist tot." Daddy is dead. Daniel lifted her out of the freight car, and as he did, her coat fell open. The medallion swung free, catching the April sunlight. His blood turned to ice. It wasn't a religious medal. It wasn't even a civilian piece. It was an SS Totenkopf badge, the death's head insignia worn by concentration camp guards. Engraved on the back in Gothic script was a name, Hauptsturmführer Klaus Zimmermann. Before we go further, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your life right now. Hit that like button if you're ready for a story that'll stay with you. And subscribe, because this is just the beginning. Daniel stood in the Polish mud, holding a child who shouldn't exist. The daughter of a Nazi camp guard, found among the very prisoners her father had brutalized. Every protocol, every regulation, every ounce of his training screamed at him to report this to command. Let them figure it out. Let the child become a statistic in some displaced persons file. But as the little girl buried her face against his shoulder, Daniel felt something crack open inside his chest. She was just a child. Whatever sins her father had committed, they weren't hers. He made his decision in the span of a heartbeat. "Your name," he said softly in German. "What's your name?" "Greta." "Okay, Greta, I'm going to take care of you now, but you have to be very, very quiet. Can you do that?" She nodded against his neck. Daniel tucked the SS medallion inside her coat and carried her away from the train car. Away from the death and the questions. Away from every rule he'd ever followed. He had no idea that this moment would define the rest of his life. That this child would become the daughter he'd never expected to have. Or that 30 years later, when she finally learned the truth, it would nearly destroy them both. But first, he had to get her out of Poland alive. Daniel tucked Greta into his duffel bag with 3 chocolate bars, and his spare undershirt wrapped around her like a blanket. If anyone discovered what he was doing, hiding an enemy child, falsifying records, preparing to smuggle her across international borders, he'd face court-martial at minimum. But the moment he'd seen her clutching that death's head medallion in a freight car full of corpses, something fundamental had shifted inside him. He couldn't explain it, even to himself. The displaced persons camp at Furenwald was chaos incarnate. Thousands of survivors flooded through daily. Polish Jews, Hungarian Roma, Ukrainian laborers, all desperate for papers, for food, for someone to tell them where to go next. Daniel used the confusion to his advantage. He requisitioned extra rations claiming stomach illness, stole medical supplies from the infirmary, and spent every free moment in the storage shed behind the motor pool where he'd hidden Greta in a nest of canvas tarps. She hadn't spoken since that first day, just watched him with those enormous blue eyes, accepting food mechanically, flinching at sudden sounds. The first night, Daniel sat cross-legged on the concrete floor and unwrapped a can of peaches, the kind his mother used to pack in his care packages before she died. "You eat first," he said in German, spooning the fruit into a tin cup. Greta stared at the peaches like they might be poisoned. Daniel took a bite himself, then offered the cup again. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached for it. She ate 3 peaches before her small body sagged with exhaustion. That's when she whispered it. "Mutti starb in the train. Mommy died in the train." Daniel felt the words like a punch to his gut. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm so sorry." The child curled into a ball on his jacket, and Daniel sat watch until dawn, his rifle across his knees, listening to her breathing. Around them, the night sounds of the DP camp filtered through, crying, arguments in 6 different languages, someone singing a Yiddish lullaby that made Daniel's throat tight. How had this child ended up in that freight car? Had her father been fleeing with his family when the Nazis collapsed? Had her mother been a prisoner or a camp employee? Daniel didn't know. Couldn't ask. Every question was a landmine. Over the next week, Daniel established a routine. Morning inspections with his unit. Midday, he'd slip away to bring Greta food and water. Evenings, after dark, he'd return with books liberated from abandoned German homes. Children's picture books with bright illustrations that made her eyes widen slightly. He taught her to play quiet games, taught her a few words of English. Apple, sun, safe. "Safe," she repeated, the word strange in her mouth. Corporal Jimmy Martinez nearly ruined everything on day 9. He followed Daniel to the storage shed, suspicious of his frequent disappearances. Daniel heard the footsteps too late. Martinez was already at the door when Daniel stepped outside, pulling it shut behind him. "What are you hiding in there, Kowalski? Black market cigarettes?" "Nothing. Just wanted some quiet." Martinez grinned. "In a storage shed? You going soft on us?" The door rattled. Greta must have bumped something inside. Martinez's smile faded. What was that? Daniel's mind raced through possibilities. Lie, deflect, bribe, threaten. But Martinez was already reaching for the door handle when inspiration struck. "Rats," Daniel said flatly. "Place is crawling with them. Big ones. You want to go rat hunting with me after chow?" Martinez's hand froze. The corporal had a legendary fear of rodents after an incident in France involving a trench and a very angry muskrat. "Hell no. You have fun with your rats, Kowalski." He walked away, and Daniel sagged against the shed door, heart hammering. That had been too close. She couldn't stay here. He had to move faster. The question wasn't whether to smuggle Greta home to Pennsylvania. That decision had been made the moment he lifted her from that freight car. The question was, how? Shipping manifests were checked. Transport rosters were verified, and a Polish-American private with suddenly acquired child would trigger every alarm in military bureaucracy. But Daniel had one advantage: chaos. The war in Europe had officially ended on May 8th, and now millions of soldiers were being redeployed or sent home. Records were being shuffled, lost, or simply ignored in the rush to demobilize. If he could get Greta to England, he could figure out the Atlantic crossing later. On May 16th, Daniel received his orders. His unit was shipping to Southampton in 72 hours for eventual transport back to the States. It was now or never. That night, he sat with Greta in the storage shed and showed her the plan. He'd drawn pictures: a truck, a ship, another truck, then a house with a tree beside it. Home. "You're coming with me," he said in German, "but you have to be very brave and very, very quiet. Can you do that?" Greta nodded solemnly. Then she did something that nearly broke him. She reached out and took his hand. Her small fingers wrapped around his calloused palm, and Daniel felt tears burn behind his eyes. "Ich hab Angst," she whispered. "I'm scared." "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." The next morning, Daniel took his duffel bag and lined it with every piece of soft material he could find. He packed his belongings around the edges to create a padded nest in the center, and when no one was looking, he lifted Greta inside. "Remember," he whispered, "silent as a mouse." She nodded, clutching the chocolate bars he'd given her. Daniel zipped the bag 3/4 closed, leaving an air gap, and hoisted it onto his shoulder. The bag weighed 47 pounds. The lies he'd have to tell weighed infinitely more. But as Daniel joined the line of soldiers loading onto transport trucks, he thought about that freight car full of bodies, about Greta's mother dying in the darkness, about all the children who hadn't been saved. He could save this one, would save this one, even if it cost him everything. The duffel bag passed inspection at 3 checkpoints, and Daniel's heart nearly gave out at each one. Southampton was a madhouse of departing soldiers, military equipment, and harried officers trying to process thousands of men through embarkation procedures. Daniel kept his face blank, his answers crisp, even as Greta shifted slightly inside the bag on his shoulder. At the final checkpoint, a bored lieutenant barely glanced at his papers before waving him through. They were going to make it. They were actually going to make it. Daniel found a corner of the barracks where his unit was temporarily housed, a converted warehouse that smelled of motor oil and cigarette smoke. He waited until the other men were at chow, then unzipped the duffel bag. Greta emerged, pale and trembling but silent. She'd been inside for nearly 4 hours. "You did so good," Daniel whispered, giving her water. "Just a little longer, okay? Then we'll be on a ship." She nodded, but her eyes were unfocused. Shock, Daniel realized. The child was shutting down. He needed to keep her grounded, keep her present. So he did what his mother used to do when he was scared as a boy. He told her a story. "Once there was a magic ship," he began in German, "that could sail through clouds instead of water." But he never finished the story. Because that's when he noticed the documents. Someone had gone through his bag. Not thoroughly, the clothing was still arranged the way he'd packed it. but enough to disturb a manila envelope he'd hidden at the bottom. The envelope he'd taken from the freight car. The one containing papers he'd found scattered among the bodies. Papers he couldn't leave behind because they bore witness to what had happened. His hands shook as he opened it now, really looked at the contents for the first time. Transport manifests, a guard roster, photographs, and a letter, dated April 12, 1945, written in a woman's desperate scrawl. To whoever finds this, my name is Elsa Bergman, prisoner number 41-293. I was taken to Auschwitz-Birkenau in 1943. Hauptsturmführer Klaus Zimmermann forced me to become his property. I bore him a daughter in December 1940. When the camp was evacuated, Zimmermann's wife learned about us. She arranged for me and Greta to be placed on this transport. She said we would be dealt with. I am writing this because if we die, someone should know that Greta is innocent. She is a child of rape and war, but she is innocent. Please, if there is any mercy left in this world, save my daughter. The letter fell from Daniel's hands. Greta wasn't just the daughter of an SS guard. She was the product of violence. Her mother had been Zimmermann's victim, and his wife, a woman whose existence Daniel hadn't even considered, had tried to murder both of them to erase the evidence of her husband's crimes. That freight car hadn't been random. It had been execution. Daniel looked at Greta, who was watching, him with those two old eyes, and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding. She wasn't the enemy's child. She was the enemy's victim, twice over, abandoned by her father, murdered by his wife, condemned for the circumstances of her birth. Your mother, Daniel said carefully in German, she loved you very much. Do you understand that? Greta's lower lip trembled. Mutti said I was special, that Fatih's other family didn't want us, but we had each other. That's right. You had each other. The photograph in the envelope showed Klaus Zimmermann in full SS uniform, standing in front of a building Daniel recognized with sickening clarity. It was Block 11 at Auschwitz, the punishment block, the death block, where prisoners were tortured and executed. Daniel had walked through that building in January during the liberation. He'd seen the standing cells where prisoners were crammed so tightly they suffocated, the wall where thousands had been shot, the basement where medical experiments had been conducted. Klaus Zimmermann had worked there, had commanded there, had brutalized prisoners there for years before taking Elsa Bergman as his victim. And Daniel had saved his daughter. The moral complexity of that truth was staggering. Every fiber of Daniel's being wanted justice for what had been done, wanted Klaus Zimmermann and his wife to pay for their crimes. But Greta, traumatized, orphaned, innocent Greta, she was the only survivor of that evil, the only witness, the living proof that even in the darkest places, life found a way. Corporal Martinez appeared in the doorway without warning. Kowalski, you coming too? He stopped, stared, took in the little blonde girl sitting on Daniel's bunk, the scattered papers, the chocolate smeared on her face. Holy hell, Martinez breathed. What did you do? Daniel stood slowly, positioning himself between Martinez and Greta. His mind calculated a dozen scenarios, denial, bribery, threats, but something in Martinez's face stopped him. It wasn't anger, it was something else. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. She was in a freight car, Daniel said simply. Surrounded by bodies. I couldn't leave her. Martinez was quiet for a long moment. Then he crossed to his own bunk, rummaged in his pack, and pulled out a tin of crackers. He handed them to Greta without a word. The little girl looked to Daniel for permission. He nodded. She took the crackers. My baby sister died in a house fire back in '42, Martinez said quietly. She was 4, same age as this kid. He met Daniel's eyes. You didn't ask my opinion, but I'll give it anyway. What you're doing, it's either the stupidest thing I've ever seen or the bravest. Haven't decided which. Are you going to report me? Martinez looked at Greta again. She was nibbling a cracker, her eyes moving between the two soldiers like she was trying to understand a language she didn't speak. Nah, Martinez said finally. But you're gonna need help. Ship's leaving day after tomorrow. You got a plan for getting her aboard? Daniel hadn't. Not really. But now, looking at Martinez's outstretched hand, he realized he didn't have to do this alone. Yeah, Daniel lied. I've got a plan. What he had was hope. And sometimes, in the ruins of war, hope was the only plan that mattered. Martinez's plan was simple, audacious, and completely illegal. Dress Greta as a cabin boy. The troop ship HMS Aquitania was a converted luxury liner now hauling soldiers home. 1,600 men crammed into spaces designed for 800 peacetime passengers. In the chaos of embarkation, with military police checking manifests and officers counting heads, nobody paid attention to the rail-thin kid in oversized dungarees carrying mop buckets between decks. They'd cut Greta's hair in a Southampton bathroom the night before boarding, Martinez holding a pocket mirror while Daniel worked the scissors. Long blonde curls fell like snow onto the tile floor. When he finished, Greta looked like a malnourished boy of 7 or 8, which was exactly the point. You're Peter now, Daniel told her in German, repeating the English name until she could say it. Peter Kowalski, my cousin's boy. You work on the ship. You don't talk to anyone. Understand? She nodded, solemn as a judge. Then, in halting English, I am Peter. Daniel's chest tightened. That's right, sweetheart. You're Peter. The Aquitania left Southampton on May 19, 1945, riding low in the water under the weight of men desperate to go home. Daniel and Martinez had secured berths below decks, cramped metal bunks stacked 3 high in a compartment that held 90 soldiers and smelled of sweat, cigarettes, and diesel fuel. Greta couldn't stay there. Too many eyes, too many questions. So they hid her in the only place nobody wanted to be, the engine room maintenance crawl space. It was a coffin of riveted steel and grinding machinery, accessible through a hatch near the aft galley. Hot, loud, dangerous, but invisible. Martinez had befriended a merchant marine engineer named Sullivan who agreed to look the other way for a carton of cigarettes and the story that they were smuggling black market watches. Kid stays quiet, stays hidden, and if we hit rough seas and he gets crushed by shifting cargo, that's not my problem, Sullivan said, pocketing the cigarettes. He'll be quiet, Daniel promised. Every morning at 05:30 before Reveille, Daniel would slip through the galley and down the service ladder to the crawl space. He'd bring Greta food scraps wrapped in napkins, cold toast, withered apples, sometimes a chunk of salt pork. She'd eat mechanically, her face streaked with engine grease, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. The crossing took 9 days. 9 days of Daniel lying awake in his bunk, imagining Greta suffocating in that metal tomb. 9 days of Martinez running interference when officers conducted random inspections. 9 days of Daniel developing the nightmares that would plague him for the next 30 years. Because at night, in the darkness of the troop ship, Daniel's mind returned to Poland. He'd see the freight car doors sliding open, the bodies tumbling out. Greta's face among the corpses, frozen and accusing. He'd wake gasping, his bunkmates cursing him for disturbing their sleep, and he'd have to physically restrain himself from running to check on her immediately. On the fourth night of the crossing, the Atlantic turned violent. 30-foot swells slammed into the Aquitania's hull, sending men tumbling from bunks and equipment crashing loose. Daniel fought his way through heaving corridors to the crawlspace hatch, terrified of what he'd find. Greta was wedged between two support beams, her small body braced against the ship's roll, her face pale as death. "I'm here," Daniel said, crawling into the space beside her. "I've got you." She didn't cry, didn't speak, just pressed herself against him while the ship groaned and bucked like a living thing. Daniel wrapped his arms around her and sang, an old Polish lullaby his grandmother used to sing, about a mother duck and her ducklings finding their way home through a storm. Płyńcie kaczuszki do domku. Greta's breathing gradually slowed. Her rigid muscles relaxed, and somewhere in the third verse, with the ship still pitching violently and the engines screaming their mechanical rage, she fell asleep against his chest. Daniel held her through the night, missing his watch rotation, ignoring the cramps in his legs. He thought about Elsa Bergman's letter, about a woman who'd endured unspeakable horror and still found the strength to protect her daughter, about the randomness of survival, how he'd opened that particular freight car on that particular day. What were the odds? 1 in 1,000? 1 in 1,000,000? By the time dawn broke gray and cold through the porthole gaps, Daniel had made peace with something he'd been avoiding since Southampton. Greta wasn't temporary. She wasn't a wartime rescue he'd eventually hand off to proper authorities. She was his daughter now, in every way that mattered. The paperwork was a lie, but the love was real. The Aquitania docked in New York Harbor on May 28th. Daniel had been coaching Greta for days, teaching her to walk with a swagger, to keep her cap pulled low, to respond to Peter without hesitation. Martinez created a distraction at the gangway, picking a loud argument with another soldier about baseball, while Daniel walked Greta past the harried customs officials checking discharge papers. "Name?" the official asked, bored. "Private Daniel Kowalski? Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania?" "That your boy?" Daniel's heart stopped, but his voice stayed steady. "Nephew, picking him up for my sister." The official stamped their papers without looking up. "Welcome home, Private. Next." They were through, on American soil, free. Daniel led Greta 3 blocks from the dock before his legs gave out. He sat on the curb of a Manhattan street, taxis honking, vendors shouting, the smell of roasted chestnuts and diesel exhaust mixing in the May afternoon, and let himself shake. Greta sat beside him, small and quiet in her cabin boy disguise. After a moment, she reached over and took his hand, just held it, the way she had in the storage shed in Germany. "Home?" she asked in English. Daniel looked at this child he'd smuggled across an ocean, this living embodiment of everything terrible and miraculous about war. "Yeah, sweetheart, home." But home came with its own complications, because waiting in Pittsburgh was Daniel's widowed aunt, the only family he had left, the woman who'd raised him after his parents died, the woman who would ask questions he couldn't answer. How do you explain the unexplainable? How do you introduce a lie you'll have to live for the rest of your life? Martinez appeared from around the corner, his own discharge papers in hand. He looked at Daniel and Greta sitting on that New York curb and grinned. "You crazy son of a bitch. You actually did it." "We did it," Daniel corrected. "Yeah, well," Martinez shuffled his feet. My bus to Texas leaves in an hour. But Kowalski? You ever need anything, and I mean anything, you write me. Address is on there. He handed Daniel a scrap of paper. I mean it. That kid's special. You're doing something good here. They shook hands, and Martinez disappeared into the New York crowds. Daniel never saw him again. But 28 years later, when everything fell apart, he'd wish he'd kept that address. For now, though, there was only the journey home. A bus to Pittsburgh. A small house in a Polish neighborhood where laundry hung between buildings and old women gossiped in windows. And a widowed aunt named Helen who'd believed Daniel when he showed up with a traumatized child, and a story about a sister who died in London during the Blitz. Aunt Helen took one look at Greta's haunted eyes and asked no more questions. She simply opened her arms and said, "Welcome home, little one." That night, Daniel lay awake in his childhood bedroom, listening to Greta's breathing from the cot they'd set up in the corner. Outside, Pittsburgh hummed with post-war life. Factories running night shifts, cars rattling over cobblestones, somewhere a radio playing big band music. The nightmares would start in earnest tomorrow. But tonight, Daniel let himself believe they'd made it, that the war was over, that they were safe. He had no idea that the real war, the one inside Greta's fractured memory, was just beginning. Greta learned to be American the way children learn everything, by watching, imitating, and burying what came before. By 1948, she spoke English with a Pittsburgh accent, thick with the vowels of Polish neighborhoods, where Daniel's Aunt Helen ran a small grocery. She answered to Greta Kowalski without hesitation, played hopscotch with neighborhood girls, learned to roller skate on the cracked sidewalks of South Oakland. To anyone watching, she was just another war orphan folded into the city's fabric. There were thousands of them, children displaced by Europe's collapse and given fresh starts in America. But at night, Daniel heard her screaming. The nightmares came 3 or 4 times a week. Greta would bolt upright in bed, eyes wide and unseeing, words tumbling out in rapid German that Daniel pretended not to understand. Mutti, nein! Die Tür! Die Tür! Mommy, no, the door! The door! He'd hold her until the terror passed, until her breathing slowed, and she remembered where she was. Safe. In Pittsburgh. In America. Far from freight cars and locked doors and the smell of death. Just a bad dream, he'd whisper. You're safe now. But Greta's nightmares were nothing compared to Daniel's. He'd wake in the small hours choking on phantom stenches, decomposing flesh, diesel exhaust, the metallic tang of blood. He'd see Klaus Zimmermann's face in the photograph, superimposed over Greta's features. The same blonde hair, the same sharp chin, the genetic legacy of a monster living in a child who deserved none of it. Some nights, Daniel would sit at the kitchen table with a bottle of whiskey Aunt Helen pretended not to notice, and he'd reread Elsa Bergman's letter until the words blurred. She is innocent. That was the refrain he clung to, the only truth that mattered. By 1953, Greta was 13, tall for her age, with her mother's delicate features and her father's ice-blue eyes. She excelled at school, particularly mathematics and languages, and had developed a quiet intensity that made teachers write things like remarkable focus and unusual maturity on her report cards. She also had gaps in her memory that troubled Daniel more than he admitted. Dad, she asked one evening in May. She'd started calling him Dad when she was 7, and the word still made his throat tight. Do you know where I was born? They were peeling potatoes at the kitchen sink, Aunt Helen humming while she kneaded bread dough across the room. Daniel's hands stilled on the peeler. London, he said carefully. The lie they'd agreed on years ago. Your mother was caught in the Blitz. I don't remember London. Greta's voice was thoughtful, not accusatory. Sometimes I dream about other places, cold places, with barbed wire and smoke. Daniel's heart hammered. Dreams aren't memories, sweetheart. I know, but they feel like memories. The lie was cracking. Slowly, inevitably. That summer, Daniel took Greta to a Penguins game. Minor, league hockey at the old Duquesne Gardens. It was a good day, a normal day. They ate hot dogs and cheered when Pittsburgh scored. And for 3 hours, Daniel let himself forget about freight cars and SS medallions. But walking home through the evening crowds, they passed a newsstand. The headline of the Pittsburgh Press screamed in bold print, Nazi war criminal captured in Argentina. Beneath it, a photograph. A face Daniel recognized instantly, though aged and weathered. SS Hauptsturmführer Werner Braun, formerly of Auschwitz-Birkenau, arrested in Buenos Aires after 8 years of hiding. Greta stopped walking. Daniel saw her eyes lock on the photograph, saw something flicker across her face. Recognition? Fear? He couldn't tell. Come on, he said gently, steering her away. Let's get home. That night, Greta's nightmares were the worst they'd been in years. She woke the entire house, screaming in German about trains and soldiers and her mother's blood. Daniel held her while she sobbed, and when she finally fell back asleep, Aunt Helen found him in the hallway. That child carries ghosts, Helen said quietly. And so do you. Maybe it's time you both talk to someone. We're fine. You're not fine, Daniel. You haven't been fine since you came home. But Daniel couldn't talk to anyone. Couldn't risk a psychiatrist or priest asking the wrong questions, making the wrong connections. The web of lies he'd constructed was too fragile. One thread pulled, and everything would unravel. So they continued. Greta went to high school. Daniel worked at the steel mill. Aunt Helen kept their secrets and their household running. And the nightmares, both his and hers, became just another part of the furniture of their lives. By 1960, Greta was 20. Beautiful in a way that made Daniel anxious about the boys who circled her like moths to flame. She'd graduated high school with honors and was working as a secretary at a law firm downtown, saving money for college. She'd become everything Daniel had hoped: kind, intelligent, determined. American. She'd also started asking questions again. Dad, I want to find my mother's family in England, she announced one Sunday dinner. I know you said they all died in the war, but maybe there are records. Cousins, someone. Daniel's fork clattered against his plate. Greta, we've talked about this. I know, but I'm 20 years old. Don't I have the right to know where I come from? Across the table, Aunt Helen's eyes found Daniel's. The warning was clear. Let her go, or the questions will only get worse. I'll help you look, Daniel heard himself say. After Christmas, we'll write to the British Records Office. It was another lie, another delay, another brick in the wall between them. But that Christmas, everything changed. Because on December 23, 1960, a letter arrived at their Pittsburgh row house. Official, federal. Addressed to Daniel Kowalski with a return address that made his blood run cold. U.S. Department of Justice, Office of Special Investigations. Someone had found the records. Someone was asking questions about the Polish refugee child Daniel Kowalski had brought home from Europe in 1945. Someone wanted answers about papers that didn't quite match up, about a dead sister in London who'd never existed, about a little girl who'd appeared in his life like a ghost. The past, it seemed, was done staying buried. Daniel opened the letter with shaking hands, while Greta decorated the Christmas tree in the next room, singing carols off-key. The words on the page blurred and sharpened, blurred and sharpened. Discrepancies in immigration records. Mandatory interview scheduled for January 15, 1961. Failure to appear will result in federal investigation. He had 3 weeks. 3 weeks to decide whether to run, to confess, or to construct an even bigger lie. 3 weeks before the truth about Greta's identity and his own crimes came crashing down around them both. Outside, snow began to fall on Pittsburgh. Inside, Daniel watched his daughter hang tinsel on the tree and wondered how you tell someone that everything they believe about themselves is fiction. The federal building in downtown Pittsburgh smelled of floor wax and fear. Daniel sat across from 2 investigators in a windowless room on January 15, 1961, his palms sweating despite the winter chill. Special Agent Harold Weiss was maybe 50, with wire-rimmed glasses and the relentless politeness of a man who'd broken stronger people than Daniel. His partner, a younger agent named Carver, took notes without speaking. "Mr. Kowalski," Weiss began, arranging papers on the desk with methodical precision. "Thank you for coming in. This shouldn't take long. We're just trying to clear up some inconsistencies regarding your daughter's immigration in 1945. Your daughter." The words hung in the air like an accusation disguised as courtesy. "What inconsistencies?" Daniel's voice was steady. 15 years of living this lie had taught him how to lie better. Weiss slid a photograph across the desk. It showed a group of soldiers at Southampton. Daniel recognized the converted warehouse, the embarkation staging area. And there, barely visible in the background, was a figure that made his stomach drop. A small person in oversized clothes carrying a mop bucket, Greta. This photograph was taken May 18, 1945 by Army Signal Corps. We're trying to identify everyone in the image as part of a larger investigation into displaced persons fraud. Weiss tapped the small figure. "Do you recognize this child?" "No, sir. Because according to your immigration paperwork, your niece, Greta Kowalski, arrived in New York with proper documentation as the daughter of your deceased sister, Margaret Kowalski, killed in London during the Blitz. But we can't find any record of Margaret Kowalski in British casualty reports. No death certificate. No birth records for Greta. Nothing." The room felt airless. Daniel forced himself to meet Weiss's eyes. "Records were destroyed during the war. You know how it was." "I do know how it was." Weiss leaned back in his chair. "I also know how many soldiers came home with children they'd acquired. Most of them had good intentions. Some didn't. Our job is to sort out which is which. This wasn't just about immigration fraud. This was about Nazi hunting. The Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations had been established to track down war criminals who'd slipped into America under false identities. And now they were looking at Greta, at her blonde hair and German accent that she'd worked so hard to erase, and her incomplete paperwork. They thought she might be a Nazi. Or worse, they thought Daniel might be hiding a war criminal's child. The interview lasted 2 hours. Daniel stuck to his story. The dead sister, the London Blitz, the lost records. Weiss probed every detail, looking for cracks, but Daniel had spent 15 years reinforcing these lies. He knew them better than the truth. Finally, Weiss closed his folder. "We'll need to interview your daughter directly. Does she remember anything about her early childhood?" "She was 4 when her mother died. She doesn't remember much." "We'll see. Agent Carver will schedule a time for her to come in. Weiss stood, offering his hand. Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Kowalski. I'm sure this will all get cleared up. But his smile said otherwise. Daniel walked out of the federal building into January cold that bit through his coat. His mind raced through scenarios. If they interviewed Greta, if they pushed the right buttons, her fragmentary memories might surface. The train car, the German language, the truth that would destroy her understanding of who she was. He couldn't let that happen. Not now. Not after 15 years of building a life. That night, Daniel did something he'd sworn he'd never do. He retrieved the manila envelope from its hiding place, bottom of his toolbox in the basement, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with tape. Inside were the documents he'd taken from the freight car. Elsa Bergman's letter, Klaus Zimmermann's photograph, the SS Death's Head medallion that had hung around Greta's neck. He should have destroyed these years ago, but some part of him had kept them as insurance, or evidence, or maybe just because they were the only proof that Elsa Bergman had ever existed. Daniel spread the documents on his workbench under the bare bulb. In the photograph, Klaus Zimmermann stared back at him, arrogant, cold, every inch the monster who'd created this impossible situation. Next to it, Daniel placed a recent picture of Greta, taken at Aunt Helen's birthday party last month. The resemblance was undeniable. The same angular jawline, the same pale eyes. Anyone who looked closely enough would see it. Dad? Daniel's heart stopped. He spun to find Greta standing on the basement stairs, wrapped in her bathrobe, her face confused and concerned. I heard you come in. You've been down here for hours. Are you okay? I'm fine, sweetheart. Just going through old things. But Greta's eyes had already found the photographs. She descended the stairs slowly, drawn by something she couldn't name. When she reached the workbench, she picked up the picture of Klaus Zimmermann with trembling hands. Who is this? Daniel's mouth was dry as sand. Nobody. Just war photos. Why does he look like me? The question hung between them like a physical thing. Daniel watched Greta's face as understanding began to dawn. Not complete understanding, not yet, but the first terrible glimmers of truth breaking through decades of careful deception. She picked up the letter, scanning Elsa's desperate handwriting. Her German was rusty but functional enough to read the words. Hauptsturmführer Klaus Zimmermann forced me to become his property. I bore him a daughter in December 1940. December 1940. Greta's birthday. No. The word came out as a whisper. No, this isn't. I'm not. Greta, listen to me. My mother died in London. You said she died in London. Her voice was rising, panic threading through anger. Who is Hauptsturmführer Klaus Zimmermann? Who is Elsa Bergman? Daniel reached for her, but she stepped back, the letter crushed in her fist. Greta, please, sit down. Let me explain. Explain what? That you lied to me my entire life? That I'm... She looked at the photograph again, and this time Daniel saw the recognition fully dawn. The SS uniform, the Death's Head insignia, the building in the background that anyone who'd read about the Holocaust would know. I'm the daughter of a Nazi, she whispered. You're the daughter of a victim, Daniel said fiercely. Elsa Bergman was a prisoner. Zimmermann raped her. You were born in a concentration camp, Greta. You're not the enemy. You never were. She was shaking now, her face drained of color. Where did you find me? In a freight car, outside Auschwitz. You were hiding under your mother's body. The truth, after 15 years of careful omission, came pouring out. The padlocked doors, the bodies, The SS medallion. Elsa's letter explaining that Zimmerman's wife had arranged for them to be murdered. The decision to save her. The smuggling. The lies. All of it. Greta sank onto the basement steps, and Daniel saw her childhood self in that moment. The traumatized 4-year-old who'd emerged from a freight car full of corpses. "I remember," she said softly. "God help me, I remember. The cold, the darkness, my mother's voice telling me to be quiet, to hide, and then silence. Just silence and bodies and the smell." She started to cry. Not the tears of a 20-year-old woman, but the sobs of the child she'd been. Daniel knelt beside her, and this time when he reached for her, she let him hold her. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked through her tears. "Because I wanted you to have a life. A real life. Not one defined by horror. But it was my horror. My truth. You had no right to take that from me." She was right. Daniel had no defense against that. He'd made the choice 15 years ago to prioritize her innocence over her autonomy, to protect her from a truth he'd deemed too terrible to bear. But in doing so, he'd built her identity on lies. They sat together on the basement steps, while the furnace rumbled and the bare bulb swung in some unseen draft. Upstairs, Aunt Helen's footsteps moved across the floorboards. She knew something was wrong but had learned when to give them space. Finally, Greta spoke. "The nightmares. Your nightmares. They were about finding me, weren't they?" "Yes." "And you never got help because you couldn't risk anyone finding out." "Yes." She pulled away from him, standing up with a new hardness in her eyes. "The Justice Department interview. They know something's wrong with my paperwork, don't they?" Daniel nodded. "What happens if they find out the truth?" "I go to prison for immigration fraud, falsifying documents, smuggling. You—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "I get deported? Locked up? Investigated as the child of a war criminal?" "Greta, I won't let that happen." But even as he said it, Daniel knew his control over the situation had evaporated the moment Weiss had slid that photograph across the desk. The machinery of justice was grinding toward them, and all the lies in the world couldn't stop it now. Greta picked up Klaus Zimmermann's photograph one more time, studied the face of the monster who'd created her. "I need to know everything," she said quietly. "About him, about my mother, about what happened in that camp. If I'm going to face whatever's coming, I need to know who I really am." Outside, a police siren wailed past their street. Inside, father and daughter sat surrounded by the scattered evidence of a past they could no longer hide from. And somewhere in Washington, files were being compiled, questions were being prepared, and the machinery of reckoning was grinding inexorably closer. The truth was coming. Whether they were ready or not, Greta Kowalski walked into the federal building on February 1st, 1961, wearing her best interview suit and carrying the weight of a truth that could destroy her. Daniel had offered to come with her. She'd refused. Whatever happened in that interrogation room, she needed to face it as herself. Not as his daughter, not as his lie, but as the person she actually was, even if she was still figuring out who that person might be. Special Agent Weiss was waiting with the same controlled courtesy, the same wire-rimmed glasses, but this time Greta noticed details she'd missed in her panic before. The faded numbers tattooed on his left wrist, the slight accent beneath his perfect English, the way his eyes lingered on her face with something more complex than suspicion. "Miss Kowalski, thank you for coming in." He gestured to the chair. "Can I get you coffee, water?" "I'm fine." Agent Carver sat in the corner again. his notebook ready. But it was Weiss who mattered. Weiss who would decide her fate. "I'll be direct with you," Weiss said, opening his folder. "Your paperwork doesn't match reality. No British records support your father's story about a sister killed in the Blitz. The shipping manifests show discrepancies. And this photograph," he slid the Southampton image across the desk, "shows a child who matches your description being smuggled onto a troop ship." Greta looked at the photograph, saw herself at 4 years old, dressed as a cabin boy, her face barely visible beneath an oversized cap. That child felt like someone else entirely, a ghost, a stranger. "So I'll ask you plainly," Weiss continued. "Who are you really? And where did Daniel Kowalski find you?" This was the moment. Lie and preserve everything. Tell the truth and lose it all. Greta met Weiss's eyes and saw something unexpected there. Not cruelty, not even judgment. Just weariness. The exhaustion of a man who'd spent decades sifting through horror, trying to separate victims from perpetrators in a world that had obliterated all the clear lines. "My name is Greta Zimmermann," she said quietly. "I was born in Auschwitz-Birkenau on December 17, 1940. My mother was Elsa Bergmann, prisoner number 47,293. My father was SS Hauptsturmführer Klaus Zimmermann, who raped my mother and then tried to have us both murdered when the camp was evacuated." The words fell into the room like stones into still water. Agent Carver's pen stopped moving. Weiss didn't flinch, but something shifted in his expression. "Private Daniel Kowalski found me in a freight car outside Brzezinka on April 19, 1945. I was hiding under my mother's body. Everyone else in that car was dead. He could have reported me. Should have reported me. Instead, he saved my life and gave me his name and raised me as his daughter for 16 years. And you remember this?" Weiss asked carefully. "You remember the camp?" "I remember fragments, nightmares, my mother's voice, the smell of smoke, the cold. And I remember the train car. I've always remembered the train car, even when I didn't understand what I was remembering." Weiss was quiet for a long moment. Then he did something that shocked Greta. He rolled up his left sleeve, exposing the full tattoo. A77734. "I was in Auschwitz," he said simply. "Arrived in 1942. Worked in the Sonderkommando until liberation. I know that freight car. I loaded the bodies onto it." The room tilted. Greta gripped the edge of the desk. "What?" "April 19th, you said. That was one of the last transports. The Germans were evacuating, destroying evidence. We were forced to load women and children, mostly prisoners, some who'd been involved with guards, into freight cars. They told us it was relocation. We knew it was execution." His voice was flat, emotionless. Years of distance creating the only bearable space between memory and present. "You loaded my mother's body?" "I loaded hundreds of bodies, Miss Zimmermann. I don't remember individual faces anymore. I can't afford to." Weiss closed his eyes briefly. "But I remember that transport, because one of the other prisoners whispered that there was a living child hidden inside. We tried to open the car, but the SS guards caught us, beat us, sealed the doors tighter." Greta felt tears burning but refused to let them fall. Someone knew I was alive? Someone knew, and someone tried to save you. They failed, but then Private Kowalski succeeded where we couldn't. Weiss leaned forward. "So here's my problem, Miss Zimmermann. By law, your father committed multiple federal crimes. Immigration fraud, falsifying documents, smuggling. He should face prosecution. Then prosecute him, Greta said fiercely. He knew the risks. He chose to save me anyway. But there's another law, Weiss continued. A moral law that supersedes federal statutes. A law that says when you have the chance to save a child from death, you save that child. Period. Agent Carver finally spoke, his voice uncertain. Sir, are you saying? I'm saying that I spent 3 years in hell because the world looked away when children needed saving. And I'm not going to punish a man who looked when it mattered. Weiss closed the folder. As far as the Office of Special Investigations is concerned, the inconsistencies in Greta Kowalski's paperwork are the result of wartime chaos. Case closed. Just like that? Greta's voice shook. Just like that. But Weiss wasn't finished. He pulled another folder from his desk drawer, this one thicker, older. However, since you've been honest with me, I'll be honest with you. We've been tracking Klaus Zimmermann for 12 years. He escaped to Argentina in 1946, lived under the name Karl Zeller, and died of a heart attack in Buenos Aires in 1958. He never faced justice for his crimes. Greta absorbed this information numbly. Her father, her biological father, had lived free for 13 years, had probably never thought about the daughter and prisoner he'd condemned to death. But his wife, Weiss continued, she's alive, living in New Jersey under the name Ingrid Mueller. We've known her location for 8 months. The words detonated like a bomb. You're telling me the woman who tried to murder me and my mother is living an hour away? I'm telling you that the Justice Department moves slowly. Building cases against Nazi collaborators requires years of evidence. But, Weiss paused, choosing his words carefully. If a victim wanted to confront her assailant before formal charges are filed, if that victim wanted to look her in the eye and demand answers, well, that would be between them. He slid a piece of paper across the desk. An address in Newark, apartment 3C. Greta stared at the address, her hands trembling. Why are you giving me this? Because I couldn't save anyone in that camp. I couldn't stop what was happening. All I could do was survive and hope that someday I'd have the power to set things right. Weiss's eyes were fierce behind his glasses. This is me setting things right. Daniel was waiting outside the federal building, pacing the sidewalk like a caged animal. When Greta emerged, he searched her face for catastrophe. What happened? Are you okay? Did they? He was there, Greta interrupted. Agent Weiss. He was in Auschwitz. He tried to save me 16 years ago and couldn't. He said... She stopped, overwhelmed. He said you were a good man, that the case is closed. Daniel sagged against the building. It's over? Not quite. Greta showed him the address. His wife, Zimmermann's wife, she's alive. Understanding dawned in Daniel's face. Greta, you don't have to. Yes, I do. Her voice was steel. That woman ordered my mother's death. Ordered my death. She needs to know she failed. They drove to Newark in silence. Daniel behind the wheel, Greta navigating, both of them processing the impossibility of what they were about to do. The apartment building was modest, nondescript, the kind of place where people disappear into ordinariness. Ingrid Mueller answered the door on the third knock. She was 70-something, white-haired, with the careful polish of someone who'd spent decades constructing respectability. When she saw Greta's face, her expression flickered, just for a moment. Recognition and terror. Do you know who I am? Greta asked in German. Ingrid's hand tightened on the doorframe. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm Greta, Elsa Bergman's daughter. You put us on a death transport in April of 1945 because your husband couldn't keep his hands off prisoners. You were supposed to die. The words escaped before Ingrid could stop them. Then quieter, with venom. You were supposed to disappear. Both of you. We didn't. My mother died, but I survived. And now you're going to tell me why. Ingrid's face twisted. Why? Because you were evidence. Because Klaus came home and told me he'd fathered a bastard with a Jew. Do you know what that meant? The shame? The disgrace? I had to protect my family's honor. Your family's honor. Greta's voice was ice. So you murdered a woman and tried to murder a child to protect your honor. I did what was necessary. But Ingrid's hands were shaking now, her carefully constructed facade crumbling. You don't understand what it was like. The pressure, the expectations. Daniel stepped forward, and something in his face made Ingrid step back. I understand that you're a coward who killed innocents and ran away. I understand that you spent 16 years living free while your victims stayed dead. And I understand that your time is up. You can't prove anything. I have papers, a clean identity. The Justice Department has everything they need, Greta said quietly. Witness testimony, financial records, survivors who saw you at the camp. You're going to spend whatever's left of your life in prison. But I needed you to see me first. Needed you to know that your victim survived. That I'm alive and free and loved. While you're going to die in a cell. This was the justice Elsa Bergman never got. The reckoning Klaus Zimmermann escaped. Ingrid Müller collapsed into a chair, and Greta saw her for what she truly was. A bitter, frightened woman who'd sacrificed everything, her humanity, her soul, her future, to protect something as worthless as pride. My mother loved me, Greta said. She died protecting me. Daniel Kowalski, a complete stranger, risked everything to save me. I've been surrounded by love my entire life. What do you have? Ingrid had no answer. Just tears and silence and the crushing weight of consequences delayed but never forgotten. Greta turned and walked away, Daniel beside her. Behind them, they heard Ingrid Müller begin to sob, the sound of a woman finally understanding that the past had come for her at last. Outside, February sunlight broke through Newark's winter clouds. Greta stopped on the sidewalk and let herself shake. Let herself cry. Let herself feel the weight of 16 years of lies lifting, replaced by something heavier but truer. Daniel put his arm around her. I'm sorry, for all of it, for lying to you. I know, and I'm angry about it. I might be angry for a long time. Greta looked at him, this man who'd saved her life and then built her a new one. But you're still my father. That part was never a lie. They drove back to Pittsburgh as the sun set, painting the Pennsylvania sky in colors that reminded Greta of things she'd rather forget and things she'd never let go. Somewhere behind them, justice was catching up with Ingrid Müller. Somewhere ahead, a life was waiting, complicated and truthful and real. For the first time in 16 years, Greta Zimmermann Kowalski knew exactly who she was, and that knowledge, painful as it was, felt like freedom. Spring came to Pittsburgh in 1961 with the soft insistence of new beginnings. Greta sat in Aunt Helen's kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd peeled potatoes and learned to make pierogi and built a childhood on borrowed identity. But everything looked different now. The same yellow curtains, the same chipped countertop, the same understanding in Helen's eyes as she poured coffee and waited for Greta to speak. I don't know who I am anymore, Greta said finally. Helen set down the pot with a gentle clink. You're the same girl who came home yesterday. The same girl who graduated top of her class. The same girl who makes her father laugh when he has his nightmares. She reached across the table, her weathered hand covering Greta's. A name doesn't change a soul, child. But it did change things. In the weeks after Newark, after Ingrid Mueller was arrested and the newspapers screamed headlines about Nazi collaborators in New Jersey, Greta felt the weight of public identity pressing down. Some neighbors whispered. A few friends from high school stopped calling. The world had opinions about who she should be now that they knew what she was. The law firm where she worked had been different. Her boss, Mr. Bernstein, called her into his office the day after the story broke. Greta had prepared for termination. Instead, he'd told her about his parents, killed in Treblinka, about survival and legacy and the courage it took to face uncomfortable truths. You keep your job, he'd said simply, and if anyone has a problem with it, they can talk to me. Daniel aged a decade in those few months. The nightmares that had plagued him for 16 years intensified, now joined by new fears about Greta's safety, about residual hatred finding her, about the fragility of the peace they'd constructed. Some mornings Greta would find him at the kitchen table before dawn, the manila envelope open, Elsa Bergman's letter in his hands. She asked someone to save you, Daniel said one morning in June, his voice rough with exhaustion. And I keep wondering if I saved you right. If I should have told you the truth from the beginning. You saved me the only way you knew how. Greta poured him coffee, stronger than usual, and now we have to figure out how to save each other going forward. It became their project. Healing. Daniel finally agreed to talk to a veterans counselor at the VA hospital. Greta joined a support group for Holocaust survivors and their descendants. They learned vocabulary for the weight they'd been carrying: trauma, survivor's guilt, complicated grief, chosen family. They learned that love could be built on lies and still be real. By 1963, something had shifted. Greta started college, University of Pittsburgh, studying social work. She wanted to help displaced children, wanted to give others what Daniel had given her, a chance. Daniel cut back his hours at the mill, spending more time with Aunt Helen, letting himself rest, for the first time since the war. And slowly, achingly, they built a new normal. One where Greta could be both Zimmerman and Kowalski, both victim's daughter and survivor, both American and something more complicated. The years accumulated like snow, soft and steady, and gradually transforming the landscape. Greta married in 1967, a kind man named Thomas who loved her fiercely and never flinched when she woke screaming from nightmares she couldn't remember. She had 2 children by 1972, a daughter named Elsa and a son named Daniel. The night Elsa was born, Greta held her daughter and wept for the grandmother who'd died protecting her, for the woman who'd written that desperate letter in a freight car, for the love that transcended death and horror and time. Daniel, at 65, held his granddaughter with trembling hands and tears streaming down his weathered face. "She has your mother's eyes," he whispered. "She has her grandmother's name," Greta replied, "and she'll know her grandmother's story." Because that was the gift of truth, painful as it was, the ability to honor the dead by remembering them fully, to carry the weight of history without letting it crush you, to say, "This happened. It was terrible. We survived. We choose love anyway." Daniel Kowalski died on a December morning in 1978, 3 days after his 71st birthday. Pancreatic cancer, swift and merciful. Greta sat beside his hospital bed while snow fell soft and white outside the window. "I never regretted it," he said, his voice thin but certain. "Finding you, saving you. Every crime I committed, every lie I told, I'd do it all again." "I know, Dad. Your mother, Elsa, she asked someone to save you. I'm glad it was me." Greta held his hand, feeling the calluses from 40 years of honest labor, and thought about all the ways a person could be a father. Biology was one way, but choice, deliberate, sacrificial, daily choice, that was another way entirely. Maybe the better way. "Me too," she whispered. Daniel's last words were in Polish, the lullaby he'd sung to her in the belly of a ship crossing the Atlantic. "Płyńcie kaczuszki do domku." Swim home, little ducklings. And then he was gone. Greta stood in her father's house after the funeral, sorting through belongings. When she found it tucked in the back of his closet, the SS medallion, Klaus Zimmermann's death's head badge. Daniel had kept it all these years. Evidence, maybe, or remembrance, or simply the weight he'd carried for her. She held the cold silver in her palm, this object that connected her to a monster and a victim and a hero all at once. Then she walked outside into the December snow, down to the creek that bordered the property, and threw it as hard as she could. It disappeared into the dark water without a sound. That night, Greta sat in her own home with her children sleeping upstairs and her husband reading beside her. She pulled out paper and pen and began to write. Not a letter, not a confession, just the story, her story, Elsa's story, Daniel's story, the truth in all its complicated, painful, redemptive glory, because the dead deserved to be remembered. The living deserved the truth, and love, real love, could withstand both. Outside, snow continued falling on Pennsylvania. Inside, Greta Zimmermann Kowalski wrote by lamplight, her daughter named for a victim and her son named for a hero sleeping peacefully overhead. Building memory into legacy, transforming tragedy into testament, choosing, always, to swim home. They say that in Pittsburgh, in certain Polish neighborhoods, older residents still remember the soldier who came home from the war with a little girl and 1,000 nightmares. Some claim he was a hero. Others whisper he was a criminal. But everyone agrees on this. He loved that child like she was his own blood, and she loved him back the same way. And in the end, maybe that's the only truth that matters. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories of courage, sacrifice, and the families we choose. Drop a comment telling me, what would you have done in Daniel's position? And remember, sometimes the bravest thing we can do is save one person when the world is falling apart. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.